Good evening. My name is Catherine Newmark. I work as a journalist. I do apologize for the slight delay in the start of this evening. Technical difficulties, as so many things these days. I welcome you to this digital edition of the Berliner Korrespondenzen, which is a collaboration between the Maxim Gorki Theatre, the German Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Humboldt University and the Allianz Kulturstiftung. And it aims to bring together voices from politics, science and culture that can help us explain the present times, which are, as always, very confusing. And we are in the midst of a pandemic, and we face a political polarization that most of us do not remember the like of. The subject we want to talk about tonight is more than the pandemic, is the American elections that are upcoming in 2 days, the polarization that has led to the present moment, the last 4 years of the Trump presidency, or as you could put it more drastically, the fight against autocracy and the fight for the future of American democracy. And of course, of the global order and therefore of everything. The fight for the future. I'm extremely pleased to be able to discuss these large and important topics with two extremely close observers of the American political scene tonight. The Russian-American journalist Masha Gessen and the British historian Harold James will join me from the States. And you will also be able to talk to us if you like. If you have remarks or questions, you can send them to the email address that you should see on your screen. It is info@berliner-Korrespondenzen in the German orthography.org. Before we begin, however, I am honored that Michel Müntefering, the Minister of State for International Cultural Relations at the German Foreign Office, will give a few introductory remarks. Here is Michel Müntefering.
Dear Masha Gessen, dear Harold James, dear Catherine Newmark, the countdown is on. The day after tomorrow, America goes to the polls, and many people around the world are anxiously awaiting the results. There are reports about the elections all over, and this is no wonder for several reasons. First, the elections matter, really matter. They will have a big impact both on US domestic politics and on international relations. There are two very different candidates with two very different visions for the United States and their role in the world. Who will win the elections will have consequences on such important global topics as the future of multilateralism, so simply speaking, the togetherness of the international community, or the international fight against climate change. Second, there is a deep and historical bond between European societies and the United States. There are so many students studying on both shores of the Atlantic every year, so many family ties, so many cultural links. That is why the elections stir so much interest. And third, if we're honest, many developments that we see in the US are not really alien to us. Just think about the discussion on racism. Of course, the situation in different countries is never identical, but for sure, racism is a reality in Europe as well. And not least, because we still have not come to terms with our own colonial past. Also, the growing polarization in the US is something we know very well from Europe. There is a strong tendency to retreat to the cozy, nationally ivory tower. Drawbridges are pulled up. Nationalism, anti-Semitism and xenophobia are back on the table. The pandemic has accelerated these concerning trends. We are all aware of the fierce discussion about recent COVID-19 measures. Therefore, we should not simply judge on developments in the US, we should rather take them as an opportunity for reflection and dialogue. Ladies and gentlemen, whatever comes with election day, it will be crucial to strengthen the bridges over the Atlantic. The friendship and partnership between Europe and the United States is strong. It is needed. Be part of it. Let's not forget, friendships have to be cultivated. Otherwise, you quickly start growing away from each other. And frankly, the divides over the Atlantic have widened. There are different reasons for this. Political disagreements, but also geopolitical trends. For many, close cooperation across the Atlantic is no longer a given, and trust has to be rebuilt. The social potential of arts and culture is crucial in doing so. Therefore, we have to strengthen the exchange between our societies, particularly at times when there are diverging political points of views. It's all the more important to foster the exchange of civil society. There is more to bilateral relations than the cooperation of governments. In this endeavor, we have to use new formats, and we have to reach a wider audience, people from different social, geographical, and political backgrounds. One example that amplifies this new approach is the Wunderbar Together campaign, which we conducted in 2018 and in 2019. This was the biggest public diplomacy campaign ever organized by the German government abroad. The idea was to initiate a dialogue with the entire society in the US, in all parts of the country. And we reached people in all 50 states, both offline and online. There were more than 2,500 events with over 1.6 million participants. Our digital channels were visited by far more than 9 million visitors. At the same time, we are currently setting up new places where people from both sides of the Atlantic can come together and develop ideas for the common challenges we share. One such place is the Thomas Mann House in the Pacific Palisades in Los Angeles, the place where the great German writer recorded over 50 BBC interviews against Hitler and the Nazi regime back in the days. Since 2018, the former US home of Thomas Mann has offered a space for fine minds from academia, economy, art and journalism. During a fellowship of up to 6 months, they work on high-profile projects and reach out to the American public. Another important such meeting space is located at the Fifth Avenue. In the course of the next years, we built a laboratory for bright and upcoming decision makers and influencers from a broad range of disciplines to work on solutions for the complex issues and challenges of our time. Ladies and gentlemen, last Sunday, Foreign Minister Heiko Maas underlined again the importance of the transatlantic relationship. He stressed one aspect which is often underestimated. Our relations to the US are also important for the unity of the European Union. Just think of our Eastern European partners who have very close ties to the US. Against the background, Minister Maas suggested a new transatlantic agenda. The essence of this agenda, no matter the outcome of the US election, our vision remains a close transatlantic partnership guided by values, enlightened rationality, compassion, trust, and mutual understanding. We will work hard to strengthen existing bridges and to build new ones on all levels through government and diplomatic channels, businesses, university exchange programs, city partnerships, or joint cultural events. These bridges will form a sustainable foundation for a durable and strong relationship between Germany, Europe, and the United States. A big thanks to all who have contributed to today's discussions, in particular the Allianz Kulturstiftung, the Maxim Gorki Theater, and the Humboldt University. Over the last month, we have all deeply felt the importance of cultural and artistic space in our daily lives, or rather, their absence. Thank you all for helping maintain the freedom of art and culture, debate and discussion across borders through digital formats such as this. And now, I'm really looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michelle Müntefering, Minister of State, for these kind introductory remarks. Let me now introduce our guests for tonight. On my one side, or screen, I have Masha Gessen, who joins us from New York. Masha Gessen is a Russian and American journalist and author who is a staff writer for The New Yorker and also publishes in many other major American media outlets. Masha Gessen has worked both in Russia and the US, and as such is a pointed observer of the political developments in both countries. Masha Gessen has written books about the Russian intelligentsia after communism, on the unlikely rise of Vladimir Putin, the passion of Pussy Riot, among many others. Gessen's book, The Future is History, How Totalitarianism Reclaimed Russia, was awarded with the National Book Award for Non-Fiction in the US, as well as the Leipziger Buchpreis zur europäischen Verständigung here in Germany. This spring, Masha Gessen published Surviving Autocracy, a book that captures the present political moment as few others do, and that will also guide our discussion tonight. Welcome, Masha Gessen. Thank you so much for joining us. And on my other side, I have Harold James, who joins us from Princeton. Harold James is Professor of History and International Affairs at Princeton University. He is a specialist on German history, on transatlantic economic history, and on globalization. Harold James' work includes, among many others, Krupp, a history of the legendary German firm, Europe Contested, from the Kaiser to Brexit, and most recently, Making a Modern Central Bank, the Bank of England, 1979 to 2003. Harold James is also a much sought-after commentator on current political and economic issues, and he writes for many international news outlets. Also, he is a member of the Board of Trustees of the Allianz Kulturstiftung. Harold James, welcome. Thank you for joining us tonight.
Nice to be with you.
So let's get started. As is our wont in this digital format, in the Berlin Korrespondences, we will roughly structure the debate into 3 topics, which we will introduce by a proposition. Probably what our audience will not expect from us, and I don't think we can deliver, is to either look into polls or into crystal balls and predict the outcome of the Tuesday elections. What we can, however, try to analyze is an election that has been called by some a battle for the soul of America, and that is surrounded by a high degree of anxiety and stress. Will the integrity of the election be upheld? Will the results be recognized by all parties? And what is, if at all, the danger of civil unrest? So what we need to do is to analyze the Trump era and the political challenges that it poses for the present. My first proposition that I want to discuss with you is the following. No matter who wins the upcoming elections, American democracy will remain fundamentally damaged. This is, of course, a deliberately strong statement, but it does point to a question that is very much at the heart of this discussion. What is the impact of Trumpism on American democracy? And Masha Gessen, you, of course, have written a book. I have it here in its German version, Autokratie überwinden, it's called. Surviving Autocracy, you called it. In which ways would you say the American experience is approaching the danger of an autocracy right now?
So actually, I want to challenge your premise because I think that we often use the word democracy as though democracy referred to a known set of institutions or procedures or laws, right, that could be put in place and sort of inhabited. That's
I'm sorry.
Foolproof, or
I lost you for a second there, but I think now I have you back.
okay. We have not yet invented a foolproof or even a good way of ensuring the government of the governed. And I think it's much more productive to think about it as a process and an ideal, really a dream, right? democracy is the dream of the people to be self-governing. And I think that at any given point, we're either sort of moving in the direction of that dream or away from that dream. So I think that phrasing the thesis as no matter who wins, American democracy will remain fundamentally damaged is misleading in the sense that it places democracy in this category of knowable and buildable things, which I don't think it is, right? I think that it is accurate and almost inarguable, right, to say that we have been moving away from democracy, from the dream of democracy for, I would say, a while, but certainly the last 4 years. Mm-hmm. And I'm sorry about that. I'm going to turn that off. Oh, I can't. This is a minor technical difficulty. And now I also want to, on this sort of, in this establishing comment, talk about why and how I use the term autocracy. So I use a framework that has been proposed by a Hungarian political scientist, sociologist, Balint Magyar, which I think is incredibly useful. So what he suggests is that there are 3 stages of autocracy. There's autocratic attempt, autocratic breakthrough, and autocratic consolidation. He developed this model for Eastern and Central European countries that have undergone this process over the last, say, 20 years. But I've been surprised and dismayed by how easy it is to apply his model to the United States. In fact, how illuminating it is to apply his model to the United States. Now, the important part here is that autocratic attempt, by his definition, is the stage at which autocracy is still reversible through electoral means. Autocratic breakthrough is when that no longer is possible. What I would argue is that the most likely scenario in which Donald Trump maintains power is not an electoral victory, but an engineered hijacking of the electoral process that results in that constitutes an autocratic breakthrough, right? What we're testing now is whether it's actually possible to reverse what's been going on in the United States through electoral means. We know that the electoral process in the United States is incredibly flawed, right? There is rampant voter suppression. The system as designed is very problematic, right? We have the Electoral College. We don't have a direct election of the president. The voter registration systems, voter enfranchisement varies widely from state to state, right? Making the system very problematic. And still, the system may work to reverse the autocratic attempt, or it may be too late. We will know, I don't know, I very much doubt that we'll know on Tuesday, but we will know sometime this month.
Harold James, would you agree with this, I'm not sure, somewhat pessimistic analysis of the danger of an autocracy in the United States? Would you see these tendencies that we of course know Donald Trump to have as an individual, but would you see them sort of in a direction of the danger, would that lie in an institutional part of the country that could actually tip and sort of give Donald Trump a way to consolidate something that he probably would like to consolidate?
Work I've always immensely admired. I think I would like to begin also with a semantic, which is that the United States was not conceived of as a democracy. It was conceived of as a republic, and the point of the republic and the balances, check, the features of the Electoral College that Masha mentioned, are actually designed to stop the tyranny of majority, in the sense that we never wanted a system in which 51% can dictate to the 49%. just because of the chance of a 2%. And obviously, you hear by my accent, I'm originally from the UK, and the UK is in exactly this kind of situation. If you'd had a sort of checks and balances in the UK, where the vote of Scotland and Northern Ireland, although they're smaller in terms of population than England, would have counted in a different way than just the number of people voting, there wouldn't have been Brexit. So these kind of checks and balances are important. The second point, I think, is that you are correct, Masha is correct, that the United States is tremendously divided. And we've got a president who's never had approval ratings that went over 50%, but they've rarely, however catastrophically he's behaved, have gone under 40%. And so this is a country in which the classic Republican kind of goals are really difficult to put in place. The third point is that at the moment, everybody is indeed nervous, not just about the results of the election, but also because both sides in this divided world are talking about coups. So the one version of the coup is that Donald Trump will look at the results on Tuesday evening and see in some states, people are thinking about Pennsylvania, that the initial results from Pennsylvania might be favorable to him, but later on, as mail ballots, postal ballots are counted, the results will shift in favor of the Democrats. And so the fear is that at that stage there will be an intervention to stop the counting process. And the Trump supporters are equally adamant that there is a democratic coup taking place, and that the media, the suppression of news, the way in which the New York Post was censored on Twitter constitutes a kind of conspiracy of the deep state. So we're in a really hopeless situation in terms of our dividedness, in terms of also our devotion to conspiracy theories. I'm actually that American institutions will be resilient, and that the Supreme Court, for instance, would not simply be a lackey of the Trump administration. So I think also, if you look at it in terms of a longer historical term, we've often seen that very, very destructive people can produce positive influences. So, you know, I'm, as I say, originally British. We grew up with Shakespeare's plays with Richard III, where a really terrifyingly destructive monarch self-destroyed and creates the basis for a much better political order afterwards, or one that Shakespeare thought was a political order. Or in Germany, people think of Goethe, and Mephisto defines himself as the power, part of the power that always wants bad, but in the end always achieves good. So there's a kind of perversity about this. And I think the kind of chaos of the election, the chaos of the last 4 years, may well push the United States onto a better path.
Now, if I may pick up on that, and I think this is something that will be possibly, that we will find a contradiction here, or sort of a conflict, or a point of debate, because one of the central points that you, Masha Gessen, made already in your 2016 text that was published 2 days after the last election, 5 rules on surviving autocracy, was institutions will not save you. And you come back to this in your book as well. Institutions have not saved us. Institutions are malleable, and they are not strong enough to resist a not so much an autocratic character as a chaotic character, as a sort of a government that is disrespecting every unwritten law of these institutions. Is that would still be your take these days, wouldn't it?
Yes, I think that there's, I'm very familiar with the desire to put trust in institutions. And I'm familiar with it, I think, emotionally and culturally, partly because, I spent a lot of my life and a lot of my career writing about what we thought was an emerging democracy in Russia, emerging democracies in Eastern Europe, where there was this very strong idea that you just have to build the thing and live in it. right? That the problem with the totalitarian state was its institutions, or the lack of democratic institutions. Americans have a very different way of putting I think, unwarranted faith in institutions, which is the American civil religion of the founding fathers and the Constitution, right? The idea that they invented the perfect system, and as long as we can spackle it and paint it and maintain it in good working order, all will be fine. The thing is that no institution can withstand a bad faith actor, right? And this is something that we have seen in the last 4 years. Donald Trump is not just another Republican president trying to use institutions to advance his agenda. He is explicitly anti-government. He is explicitly destructive, and he explicitly treats institutions of checks and balances and the courts as an obstacle in his path, which is, I think, distinct from even such a bad faith president as George W. Bush, who is now in the American imagination sort of has been rehabilitated, but this is a president who lied to the world in order to start a war, right? And yet Trump, the way that he has, for example, approached the Supreme Court is, to me, reminiscent of the way a real estate developer in New York, which is, of course, exactly what Donald Trump is, would approach City Hall. Right. Okay, so he didn't get permission to build 16 stories in an area zoned for 3 stories. So he's going to try to buy the air rights. He's going to try to approach a different bureaucrat. He's going to try to lie and say that 16 stories is actually 3 stories. He's going to try everything. He's not going to do the one thing that the institution of the courts takes as its basic assumption, that once the Supreme Court of the United States has spoken, that's the final decision on the matter, unless then the legislative branch takes it up. But if the court has said that something is unconstitutional, that's the end of the road. Donald Trump, in that particular case, and in many similar cases with other institutions, is simply not willing to accept the basic assumption on which these institutions function, and that makes it impossible for them to save us.
One question that can also be asked in this context, which is, of course, it's not just Donald Trump being a bad faith actor or being a sort of reality TV president who rules by constant outrage, by a constant Twitter feed, which covers up a lot of the policies that are happening at the same time, because we're always just shocked enough to read his tweets, but not really debate the policies that are happening at the same time. But the institutional question also comes back to the Republican Party. And this may be a question to Harold James. Has been what's one of the most shocking things to me has been the way the Republican Party has fallen in line behind Donald Trump after initial resistance. And would that sort of speak to a larger and older problem, not just of institutions, but also of this two-party system, which does not allow for a political alternative, even to a unpopular president who many consider to be dangerous, even in his own party?
Well, right. I mean, I agree with that, with much of that characterization. But I think also if you just do a kind of speculation, what would happen, for instance, Ted Cruz had become president in 2016 instead of Trump had been the candidate and been president, I think you would have found much of the same kind of move of the Republican Party. So in that sense, it's not just Donald Trump having captured the Republican Party, it's the Republican Party having moved in a certain way, and it's moved away from the old internationalist republicanism. So I was just reading a wonderful biography of James Baker, but that was a different world. So I really do think that movement there. But replying to Magda, to Masha, I think the story of the what's happened, whether we can rely on the courts or not. Actually, I mean, I'm really impressed by the way that Chief Justice is really defending the traditional United States view of what the role of the Supreme Court is. And I'm also encouraged by recent court decisions. So on the voting, in particular, counting of late ballots, an outcome from the Supreme Court that the president was really very, very angry about, and lots of angry tweets. So there really is a deep commitment, and in that sense, I think it is really a different issue having institutions that have developed over very, very long periods of time, and having institutions in Russia or in other post-Soviet states in the 1990s, where the layering in terms of assumptions and deep embedment of the assumptions is more slight. I mean, I agree, though, in theory with Masha that you could, if you get a unique bad of event, really destroy the basis of even very well-established institutions. And I think, for instance, the UK government is actually much further down that road than the US government. So I'm basically rather encouraged, despite everything over the last 4 years, by the resilience of American institutions and by the relative incapacity of Donald Trump to destroy them. He undoubtedly wanted to try. That's absolutely right. Steve Bannon's kind of rhetoric at the beginning, it was his rhetoric. He wanted to destroy them, but he didn't.
I do apologize for the poor sound quality. I do hope you, as I did, understood most of that, even though it came across with a bit of a sound problem. Maybe this is a good moment to move on to a sort of maybe somewhat a larger also viewpoint, which also takes into account the American influence on an international stage, which is what we put into a proposition our second proposition that you will also, I hope, disagree with, which is the American century was already fading out, but Trump brought it to an abrupt and disorienting end. And now, Harold James, you wrote recently in a piece that the US is increasingly resembling the USSR in its final stages, which is a comparison that Masha Gessen has also been working with, or at least the sort of as a lens to look at the US. Why did you write that? What is your feeling? In which sense is the US approaching the end of the totalitarian sort of, or the last stages of the USSR as a socialist state?
Well, as I said, I think the deep embedment of institutions in the United States is different and more resilient in the Soviet comparison. But I had two things in mind. One was that the Soviet Union had a planning system that was more and more inefficient and more divergent with the requirements of just evolving the technical responses to modern economy and modern society. My comparison there was with Wall Street, which was also a kind of planning mechanism in a sense. I mean, I think a much better planning mechanism than the Soviet planning mechanism, but it still reached the end of its rope. And we're seeing some of the dysfunctionalities of that at the moment. And the second part of the comparison was that the Soviet Union was really shocked by a chance event, by the nuclear explosion in Chernobyl in 1986, and that the COVID crisis has exposed the same kind of deep-seated problems, deep-seated racial problems, political problems, economic problems, lack of access to medicine, lack of access to education, really a whole array of sources of problems that were there a long time before Donald Trump and really should have been tackled a long, long time ago. So we're dealing with a world where the reality has been brutally exposed by a combination of things, by the Trump presidency, but by the COVID crisis in particular.
Masha Gessen, you have used this comparison to great effect. I remember in particular a piece that you wrote for The New Yorker in January of 2019, where you explained to us the Mafia State, the concept of the Mafia State as it applies to Putin's Russia and as it applies to a certain extent, possibly to the Trump administration, in understanding the mixing of power and economic self-interest or self-enrichment. Now, maybe you could just explain to our audience the Mafia State and in how much that is sort of how much the Russian model can be applied to the US.
Okay. It's funny, this is the other concept of Balint Magyars that I have found incredibly useful in understanding both Russia and now, weirdly, the United States. So the Mafia State is actually a model that was worked out on the Hungarian case, right? And according to Magyar, it's a system of government that is run like a mafia clan, right? With a patriarch in the middle who distributes money and power. Now, this to me is one of the key concepts in it, because you understand how much of a sort of a centrifugal system it is, and how personalized it is, and how some of the traditional ways of analyzing sort of the strength or weakness of a regime, like, for example, are the elites dissatisfied, become entirely irrelevant because there's no solidarity among the elites when they're receiving everything from the hands of this one person who is distributing money and power. Now, another very important trait of a mafia state is that it's a family. You can be born into the family, you can be adopted into the family, but you can't voluntarily join the family, and even more important, you can't voluntarily leave the family. You can be kicked out, but you can't just sort of resign the family. Now, oddly, Donald Trump, he very much acts like a mafia boss without a mafia. He doesn't actually have a reliable clan outside of his literal family, right? But his literal family has become a very important part of American politics. But he has managed to exert some sort of mafia-like forces on the Republican Party, most notably just the demand of personal loyalty under threat of political murder by Twitter. Republicans have, by and large, Republicans seeking re-election certainly have, by and large, fallen in line, or not by and large, have entirely fallen in line with the sort of autocratic audience of one way of running the Republican Party, in large part, I think, because there's this threat of taking away their power simply by libeling them or whatever, doing the Trump thing to them on Twitter.
The fascinating part of this is that you also used it to explain to us the character of the Russian interference in the American election, because there is also an element of the mafia state that is relatively unprofessional, if I understood you correctly.
Well, I think that one of the big misconceptions about Russian interference in American politics is, in addition to, I think, habitually exaggerating its impact and scope, but also exaggerating its competence, but also thinking that there's a political agenda. But rather, I think we have to understand it as a loose network of independent contractors, each of whom has their own grift, their own profit motive, and they're largely uncoordinated. They're trying to curry favor with one another at the same time that they're trying to curry favor with or offer favor to the Trump campaign or the Trump administration now. And a lot of the time they're overselling whatever it is that they have to sell, right? So that really destroys the kind of the vague image of the mastermind, the master plan, the Putin takeover, right? It doesn't make it any less destructive necessarily. But I think it is important to understand that it's a bunch of sort of grifters and conmen and swindlers and not a united political front.
I mean, the interesting part for me in this was also, if you think about sort of large global scale political orders, there has always been the feeling with Trump's sort of America first, his sort of return to national isolationism, that there is a not very thought through part of it. There is a lot of things that are sort of hanging in the air. And we had this tendency in the last 4 years to sort of reinstate a Cold War where there's Putin trying to exert influence and there's Trump as a sort of a counter figure or a sort of trying to be the same type of autocrat. Now, if you look at it from a sort of this small scale, I would like to hear your take on this also, Harold James. What is the sort of the general global political impact of the fact that we are dealing with sort of small-scale interest actors here that do not seem to carry any more of the old idealism where it was socialism versus democracy and you could rally the world behind ideas?
Yes, I think that's certainly part of the picture. I think in part, this is really not to disagree with Masha Gessen's analysis, to give a kind of additional side to it. In one part, I think the Russian campaign, the uncoordinated Russian campaign, was simply about ridiculing the United States. That one of the things that suited the Putin worldview was that if there was a clown elected as the president of the United States, it would discredit the United States in the eyes of the rest of the world. And to that extent, it was brilliantly successful. I think the image of the United States has suffered a great deal of damage over the past 4 years. But there's another aspect of it that I think, when you're thinking about the question of American decline and the end of the American century, the question that you originally posed, one part of it is simply the decreasing size relative to the rest of the world of the United States economy. But if you look at it from that angle, the big rivalry and the big issue of the future is not really to do with Russia, but it's to do with China. And that also has been a big part of the campaign. And I think it is one of the ways in which Trump has changed the United States permanently, because the Biden campaign also is clearly very, very oriented to limiting or to challenging China. It's partly to do with the way that China itself has been transforming under President Xi. But it's also to do with the way in which American people think, and the China issue is one of the real explainers of why Trump got elected in the first place, why so many Americans want to push back against Senator Clinton's multilateralism, and dealing with China. I think will be a crucial part in the next administration as well. So one of the things you saw, I think, in the campaign very strikingly was how part of the effective campaign of Joe Biden was to say that Trump is, after all, a man with a Chinese bank account, and that Biden is going to have much more rational plan for how to deal with China, and one that requires kind of multilateralism, because it requires working, for instance, taking up what Minister Montefiore was saying at the beginning of the discussion, working with allies and partners in Europe.
Maybe this is a good moment to sort of go take a last step and talk about what can be the hopes. Masha Gessen has already spoken about democracy as a moving target that we can move towards or away from. Now, we put this section under a proposition that is the following. The last 4 years have shone a glaring light on the need for radical social and political change, which again is a very rough way of putting the fact that there seems to be a necessity to not only reinvent the world order, but also sort of infuse democracy with some sort of new life, and also maybe a new sort of idealism. And one of the points that you, Masha Gessen, deal with a lot in your book is language. What that language matters, the way we speak about the world, and the way what sort of language we use in politics. I wonder if you could elaborate on that a little bit.
So yes, a third of the book fully is devoted to both media and language, which are obviously related issues. I've thought a lot about how Trump uses language, which are a couple of different ways in which he uses and abuses language. One is in the way of the leader of a totalitarian movement, which is very much what he aspires to be. He uses language to mean its opposite, right? So, and he has a particular knack for recognizing phrases and words that have to do with relationships of power and hijacking them or reversing them to, invariably to position himself as the victim, as somebody who is in need of sympathy. But for example, he will say that he is the victim of a witch hunt by, a democratic witch hunt. I mean, the most powerful man in the universe cannot be the victim of a witch hunt. There is a power relationship that is inherent in the idea of a witch hunt. And whoever is being hunted in a witch hunt has less power than the hunters, right? So, and he will use words and phrases either over a long period of time or very briefly, like safe space, or, he hijacked the phrase fake news and turned it into its opposite. He now calls fact-based mainstream media fake news. But it was actually a phrase that was briefly in circulation to describe the Trumpian news universe. And then he also uses language to mean nothing, which is familiar to us not from the totalitarian past, but from the more recent autocracies, like Putin uses language to mean nothing. He just will fill the information sphere with meaningless phrases, a lot of factoids that don't check out, but that just create a lot of bureaucratic noise. Trump doesn't create bureaucratic noise. He creates emotional noise. But it's a similar sort of thing where there's just a lot of words and no meaning. And I think that creates a kind of information, combined also with just the absolute onslaught of Trumpian pronouncements and news and created news events. It creates a constant haze of information, a constant haze of language, where existing in the American information sphere now, to me, is like living in a very, very polluted city where there's so many particles in there you can't really see. Every so often it rains or the wind blows, and for a moment you have clarity. And then you're back in this state of total haze. If you've ever been to a place that's that polluted, you know exactly what I'm talking about, right? And so I think that there are ways for journalists to be aware of this issue and to try to confront it. Now, I don't think that there's a good way of handling this. This is a net loss for our society and a net loss for the media, right, to try to work in this environment. But at least if we understand this, I think we can take a sort of harm reduction approach and think about how we use language, how we report on nonsensical pronouncements, right? This is one of the sort of existential issues for journalists. How do you report on a president who says things that don't mean anything but have real life consequences? Think about that. That's a real conundrum. For example, Trump says, use disinfectant, inject or ingest chlorine bleach, and it's going to take care of the coronavirus. And then this is a nonsensical pronouncement on the face of it. And then the next day, he also says he was kidding, which makes it doubly nonsensical. He said something that didn't mean anything, and he also didn't mean it. At the same time, by the night of the day when he said it, poison centers around the United States were overwhelmed with calls from people who had either ingested disinfectant or were about to ingest disinfectant. So this was having real life consequences. So how do you report on something that is nonsensical but has real-life consequences? It is extremely difficult. And I think if we at least frame it in terms of trying to reduce the harm that is inherent in the amplification, that will make things a little bit easier for us to handle and to understand.
If I may just ask something in that direction, which I've always wondered about, because your first rule of survival in an autocracy was believe the autocrat. Now, Trump makes it extremely difficult to believe him because of exactly what you described just now so eloquently. And I think it's also one of the main lines of defense of many of his supporters or of the people who don't think he's that big of an evil is to basically say, yes, it's a lot of bluster, but he doesn't mean what he says. He doesn't mean that he will not accept the election result. He doesn't mean what he says, which is true. He has made it somewhat undistinguishable what is true and what is false, which is already Hannah Arendt taught us sort of an inroad of politics into totalitarianism. But the question is, how do we believe the autocrat or the autocratic attempt if he does not speak anything that makes sense?
I think it has to do with what I was mentioning earlier, which is real-life consequences, right? We cannot discount what he says. We have to always bear in mind that, that's just Trump being Trump is actually always something to worry about rather than something to calm us. And of course, a lot of the things that I was referring to when I was writing this in 2016 were things that people were discounting because their own imaginations couldn't assimilate them. Of course, he's not going to issue a Muslim ban. That would be impossible. You can't close the country to Muslims. Actually, you can. And if you try hard enough, the Supreme Court will go along with it. He is not going to build the wall. Come on, that was just a campaign line. He is not going to act like this in office. He is not going to bring Ivanka into the White House. Think about all the things we found completely impossible to believe in 2016. He's not going to use the powers of the presidency to try to prosecute political opponents. He's not going to weaponize the Justice Department and make it into an army of his personal henchmen, which is very much what he was saying at the time. Absolutely. All that has stopped him or that has slowed down these attempts is some innate, inertia and sense of decency still inherent in some American political institutions. But certainly not Donald Trump, not certainly Donald Trump becoming presidential. He means what he says.
Even if it doesn't make sense. So maybe because we are sort of nearing the end of our discussion, Harold James, if we just look at sort of what is necessary to maybe not renew democracy, but to sort of maintain a semblance of a political debate that can move forwards in the US, what would be, in your opinion, the most urgent steps that would need to be taken? What is the most sort of burning question of the moment come Tuesday? But beyond that, where is the point we need to start at?
I thought I liked very much heard, and I grew up with this fantastic essay that Alexander Solzhenitsyn wrote in the 1970s with the title "Live Not by Lies," and this was the time when a few years later Václav Havel wrote about the power of the powerless. And confronting lies and thinking about the clear meaning of ideas does seem to me to be intellectually what we need to do, what we need to think of. But you've also got to ask, how does that impact the lives of everybody out there? How does it impact the lives of voters, of the people to whom, in the end, the politicians are responsible? And it does seem to me that we've got a really good opportunity to address some of the glaring problems, inequities in American life. If you think about the education system, The United States has some of the best universities in the world, but it has some of the worst education in the world. If you think of medical care, some of the best hospitals, I mean, I think the best hospitals in the world, but also really a medical system that leaves out many. And, you know, that's I think, one of the things that's quite interesting in terms of the list of things that Trump wanted to do but didn't do. He partially pushed back on a bit of Obamacare, but he never succeeded in replacing it by anything. We've got an urgent need now to do something about it. And the COVID crisis is the opportunity, I think, to rethink medical care and to make it more widely available to more people. But in particular, something like the use of technology, telemeds, is transformative. Education, I think you can think of a transformation as well. So it is a question of improving the political language, of really thinking about what we mean when we say things. But it's also a question of making lives better for people who really were left out of what has been happening in the United States, not just over the last 4 years, but over the last 40 or 50 years.
Before we come to an end, we do have time for one or two audience questions. Nino, my colleague Nino, has collected them. Do you have any for us?
Yes, I have one question that is directed at Masha Gessen. It says that Masha Gessen said that Trump would not stay because of an electoral victory, but because of a possible autocratic breakthrough. How likely do you think is such an autocratic breakthrough?
I'm not in the business of making predictions. I think we can, we can look at the current situation. I think that's the job of journalists, is to try to describe things as they are as accurately as possible. At the moment, what we have is a highly unusual election in a terribly flawed electoral system. It's an election in which more people have now voted early than ever before in history, and by some counts more than voted in the 2016 election altogether. But there are also a huge number of mail-in ballots, some of which, according to the laws and regulations of the appropriate states. Now, you have to understand that the U.S. elections are run by about 10,000 different local entities. It's a federal election system that is basically run by local authorities everywhere. But then we have the Electoral College, which is in some ways regulated federally and in some ways regulated locally. So different states have different laws on how its electors can behave. Some states, for example, allow electors to make their own decisions. Some states make it legally obligate them to cast their votes in accordance with the majority vote in the state. Although there's not a single state that has any actual penalties for violating the law on electors if it bans what's called faithless electors. Then we have a president who has cast doubt on the elections, who has cast doubt in particular on mail-in ballots. And we have a series of decisions, or rather non-decisions, by the Supreme Court on different states with somewhat contradictory results. So some states, like Wisconsin are going to stop counting mail-in ballots that come in after, they are not going to count mail-in ballots that come in after election dates. And some states, again, in accordance with the inaction of the Supreme Court, like Pennsylvania, will count mail-in ballots that come in after election day. We also have indications from Supreme Court justices, or in particular Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh, who wrote on the recent Wisconsin opinion, that he views the election as something that ends and yields a result on November 3rd. Now that is in direct contradiction to the process that is currently underway. The process that is currently underway cannot yield a definitive result on November 3rd. Right? Having that contradiction already in the public space before November 3rd is a huge worrying sign. Right? These things are likely to clash, and if they do clash, I think the outcome is likely to be favorable to Trump and not favorable to voters. So that's as much as I can say, about the likelihood of an outcome. And the last thing I would add is, of course, we have a president who is openly encouraging political violence, and we have already seen very worrying examples of this election-related political violence. Yesterday, the Biden campaign had to cancel an event in Texas after being ambushed on the road by Trump supporters. There's no way to underestimate the importance and the frightening implications of an event like that.
Thank you. Nino, we had one last question that we still have time for.
We have one last question, again for Masha Gessen, and it says, Masha Gessen talked about real-life consequences. My question is, what are the real consequences for minorities in the US already right now?
I don't think we have enough time to detail the real-life consequences for minorities in the US right now, but the book Surviving Autocracy has 3 sections. One is on institutions, one is on language and media, and one is on American self-identity. And I think this has been probably the most lasting impact of the Trump presidency, even if the Trump presidency ends in 3 months, which is the redefinition of the American concept of us in basically white supremacist terms. The American self-definition, what the Israeli philosopher Moshe Halberstam calls the circle of us, has over time been pretty consistently expanding to include first people of color, formerly enslaved people, to enfranchise women, to enfranchise immigrants, to enfranchise LGBT people. That process of broadening out has been reversed by Donald Trump. The most profound consequences, I think, have been for immigrants. There's been and people in need of international protection, both on U.S. soil and at the border of the United States. There has, of course, been profound impact on the Black community in increased violence and police brutality. And then we have also seen the reversal of gains in LGBT rights.
Well, this is not a very optimistic note to end on.
I'm sorry.
But these are worrying times, and they are stressful times, and I'm afraid they might remain stressful for quite some time. Nevertheless, I would like to thank you both very much for your insights and your analysis. And let's all keep our hopes up for November the 3rd and beyond. Thank you for your participation and your time.
Thank you.
And thank you, of course, to you, our online audience. Thank you for your patience. Thank you for tuning in and following. The debate will continue to be available online. And if you prefer reading, say, to watching things on screens, we have this wonderful book series that is edited from the Berliner Korrespondenzen. There are new volumes by Sheila Ben Habib, by Max Czolek, by Suleiman Bashir Diagne. You can find those in bookstores or online possibly right now, the best version of this. Many thanks also to everyone involved in the preparation of this event, especially to the team here at the Gorki Theater and to the Allianz Kulturstiftung, the German Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Humboldt University. Good night. Thank you. Take care.